Okay, let's get going. Hi, everyone. I'm Martin Goodson. Welcome to the Machine Learning Meetup. I am joined by my colleague from Evolution AI, Alessio Sorullo, and also by Andrew Lampinen, who's our speaker today from DeepMind. So, as usual, the same format as usual. Andrew's going to talk for about 40 minutes. Please use the QA function to add any questions that you may have. And you can chat to me and to Alessio using the chat function, but use the QA for putting your questions in. And then at the end of Andrew's talk, we'll have about 20 minutes of QA, which will be hosted by myself and Alessio. With that, I'm going to hand over to Andrew, and I'll see you shortly.
Thank you. Just give me a second to present my slides.
Andrew, I think you're muted. Strangely.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, cool. You can hear me now and you can see my slides?
Yeah, all good.
Perfect. Okay. Yes, I'm Andrew, and I'm here to tell you about our paper, Language Models Show Human-like Content Effects on Reasoning. And this is work I did with Ishita Dasgupta and a bunch of other awesome collaborators. So I'd like to acknowledge their contributions up front. So I'd like to start off by asking, what is reasoning? And like any reasonable person, I went on Wikipedia to look up the answer. And if you look at what this answer says, you'll find that it mentions logic quite a bit and talks about how reasoning is something that humans do and perhaps something that's uniquely human. So looking at this, you might conclude that reasoning is some uniquely human capability for applying logic. But there's been a long-standing debate in cognitive psychology about how logical people actually are. This sometimes goes by the name of the rationality wars. And on one side, there's been a lot of work arguing that in various ways, humans make rational, optimal decisions, and other works arguing that humans are predictably irrational or use heuristics and biases. And I'm not going to go into all of the details of this debate, but one key distinction is about the role of abstract logic in human reasoning versus the effects of the content we're reasoning about. So to make this clearer, logical inferences are independent of the content that you're reasoning about. For example, a statement like if X, then Y, logically implies the consequence if not Y, then not X, regardless of what X and Y happen to represent. And so a system that reasons abstractly, that is, doesn't pay attention to what the variables X and Y represent, is guaranteed to be systematic in the sense that it will always reach the same conclusion from a particular logical structure. And so, do humans exhibit this kind of abstract reasoning? That is, are thought processes more like logical inference processes, or is there something messier going on inside our heads? I'm not going to try to fully resolve this question, but I'm going to tell you about two long-standing findings in the literature. The first is that people judge arguments by their content, not just by using logic. So in classic studies, looking at people's judgment of the logical validity of syllogisms, people are biased by their beliefs about the conclusion. So for example, if you look at this syllogism, all students read, some people who read also write essays, therefore some students write essays. You may think that's a valid argument, or you may not. But if we take an exactly logically equivalent argument, like all students read, some people who read are professors, therefore some students are professors, it makes it easier to see that there must be a logical error in that argument because the conclusion is sort of unexpected. This finding has been established since at least the 80s and even the 70s, I think, in cognitive psychology. And the effect is very, very strong. So if you take naive subjects, that is not, professors of logic or something, and you give them these kinds of tasks, people will say an argument seems valid 92% of the time if the conclusion is believable, regardless of whether the argument is actually valid. But for unbelievable conclusions, they're a bit more sensitive to the logic. So people are able to pay attention to the logic when the conclusion is surprising, and so they see that something might be wrong. They can make that inference, but they're strongly biased by the content of the conclusion. But content doesn't only lead to biases, it can also facilitate our reasoning. So for example, in these classic, even older set of studies from Wason, he looked at giving people a simple rule. So the rule was, there are some cards in front of the person, and the cards have a number on one side and a color on the other side. And the rule is that if they have an even number on one side, then they are red on the other side. And Wayson asked them a simple question, which is, which of these cards that you see depicted on the right would you need to flip over to check to see if the rule is true or false? And when most people answer this question, what they say is that you need to check the card with an even number to see if it's red on the other side, which is correct. But then they say you need to check the card that's red to see if it has an even number on the other side, and that's wrong. That's confusing the converse and the contrapositive of the rule. But if you put the same rule into different content into the same logical rule, almost everybody gets it right. And in particular, one manipulation that's been explored there is a rule like the cards have ages and beverages on them. And the rule is that if a beverage is alcoholic, then the age must be over 18 or 21 or whatever your local drinking age is. And if you frame the rule like that, almost everybody knows which cards are the right ones to check. So familiar content can bias reasoning, as in the previous example, but it can also facilitate reasoning. Okay, to sum that up, human reasoning is not fully abstract logic. Instead, it is content dependent. But of course, I'm not here to talk to you about humans today. I'm here to talk to you about large language models, which have exploded onto the scene in AI research. And in particular, there's been a growing interest in language model reasoning. So if you do a Google Scholar search, you'll see a ridiculous number of publications on that. And even if you narrow this down to the last few years, there's still quite a few publications. And these span a wide range of spaces, from chain of thought prompting elicits reasoning in large language models to large language models still can't plan. And there's been a lot of different kinds of works, but some of them fall onto a sort of spectrum that goes from large language models are capable of reasoning in some sense to arguments that what language models are is just a pile of tricks and not real reasoning. And why might people be skeptical of reasoning in language models? After all, we've seen from works like GPT-3 that it's possible for language models to perform some tasks like math and logic that we think of as requiring reasoning. However, some of these more critical papers have observed that language models tend to respond more accurately about frequently occurring situations. And they've suggested that this raises questions on the extent to which these models are actually reasoning. That is, language model reasoning also doesn't appear to be purely abstract. It depends on things like the frequency of the content that the model is reasoning about. And just to put this in the context of the human work, it's almost like the rationality wars are coming back, where people were arguing, well, humans are rational reasoners or we're not. People are now arguing, well, language models are capable of reasoning, or it's just a bunch of, heuristics and tricks. So content affects reasoning in large language models, and this has raised questions about whether they're capable of real reasoning. Okay, why might content affect the inferences of large language models? Well, this is kind of by design, right? Large language models are intended to have prior expectations over language. That's what they're used for. And these expectations often reflect the beliefs and knowledge that humans have about the world. So for example, if we take one of these common social situations like rules about drinking, and if we ask a language model about it, like I did with Chinchilla here, there's some pretty sophisticated knowledge about that stored in the language model somewhere. So it actually is even asked me a clarifying question about where I am in the world before it gives me an answer for how old you have to be to drink. So given that language models have some expectations about the content in language that match some of human knowledge and beliefs about the world, and given that content affects language model reasoning, we asked in this paper whether the content effects on language model reasoning would match the effects that have been observed in humans. And that's what I'm going to try to tell you about for the rest of the talk. So how did we look into this? Well, we created 3 new data sets for evaluating content effects on reasoning. The first and simplest is a basic natural language inference data set, where we give statements like, if C's are bigger than puddles, then puddles are smaller than C's. And that's a kind of statement that we would think of as being consistent with the beliefs that a human has about the world. C's are indeed bigger than puddles. But we can also flip the order and say, if puddles are bigger than C's, then C's are smaller than puddles. And that's a statement that we would think of as violating people's beliefs about the world. We could also make nonsense statements by just substituting the nouns C's and puddles for some nonsense words. And we did similar things with data sets more reminiscent of the human experiments I told you about before. So we created syllogisms where the statements in the syllogism are either plausible, the conclusions are plausible, like guns are dangerous things, or they're implausible, like all dangerous things are guns. Clearly, there are some dangerous things that are not guns. And we also created nonsense versions in a similar way. And similarly, for these rule reasoning tasks, we can create realistic rules like, if the clients are going skydiving, then they must have a parachute. Or we can create arbitrary rules, more like the original task, like if the cards have a plural word on one side, then they must have a positive emotion on the other side. And we created all these data sets from scratch in order to avoid any potential that the language models would have encountered the stimuli during their training process. So I'm going to walk you through the results of our experiments on these data sets. The first task, natural language inference, is the simplest. And in this task, we gave the model a prompt like, if C's are bigger than puddles, then puddles are, and we asked the model to complete that with either smaller than C's or bigger than C's. And what we find is that comparing a 7 billion parameter model on the left and Chinchilla with 70 billion parameters on the right, the 7 billion parameter model doesn't do very well. Chinchilla does a bit better, but only on the consistent statements. But in both models, belief-consistent inferences are endorsed much more often than belief-violating inferences. So the model is much more likely to say puddles are smaller than C's than to say puddles are bigger than C's. And the reason the model is below chance here, by the way, is because of a tendency to repeat words. So since there's bigger in the prompt, the model would prefer perhaps to say bigger in the answer as well. Okay. So the model shows a bias such that it prefers belief-consistent inferences. But is there any way to change this? Well, we explored a couple of possibilities. The first is just changing the instructions in the prompt. So on the left panel here, you'll see the results I just showed you. And on the right is the results if we just add to the prompt, carefully evaluate these logical arguments. And what you can see is that with that simple change to the prompt, both models do quite a bit better, and Chinchilla in particular is doing much better. It's above chance in all conditions. And the belief bias, the tendency to endorse statements that are believable more, has substantially reduced, although it hasn't completely gone away. And similarly, we could give a set of few-shot examples where we give examples of a correct logical inference using the nonsense stimuli so we don't bias the model about beliefs. And if we do that, what we find is that the models both improve substantially, and for the larger model chinchilla, the bias almost completely goes away. So at least on these simple toy NLI tasks, large language models are biased by how believable the conclusions of their inferences are. And this effect can be ameliorated by adding instructions or examples. We next moved on to look at the more interesting, complex inference processes that have been explored in humans. So the first one I told you about was the syllogism argument belief bias effects. And we set up these problems for the model where we lay out the argument like all diamonds are gems, some gems are transparent, therefore some diamonds are transparent. Then we ask the model to choose between the answer, this argument is invalid, or this argument is valid. And what we find is, I'm plotting here the portion of the time the model says valid. So if the model were answering perfectly, all the bars on the left would be at 100, and all the bars on the right would be at 0. What you can see is instead that there's a strong bias by conclusion believability. So the mint bars show conclusions that are believable, and most of the time the model is saying that the argument is valid in that case, regardless of whether the argument is actually valid. And by contrast, if the conclusions violate the model's expectations, there's more of an effect of the logical structure, and the model is overall less likely to say the argument is valid. And if you compare these results to the patterns of findings that I described from the human literature, it's actually surprisingly similar numerically to the pattern of results that were produced in those earlier studies, where most of the time, for believable conclusion, people say that the argument is valid, but for an unbelievable conclusion, people are more sensitive to the logical structure and are a little bit biased by that when they make their conclusion. Now, unfortunately, in the case of the syllogisms task, adding more example shots doesn't seem to help performance that much. There is a significant improvement in performance, but the overall magnitude of that improvement is quite small, as you can see from this plot. However, what does improve performance substantially is giving a slightly different task framing. So in these experiments, we ask the model to complete an argument with the correct conclusion from the set of all possible statements involving two of the entities in the argument. And although this task seems harder, there's many more options to choose from, the model actually does substantially better and exhibits a much smaller bias effect. So this is an interesting observation that depending on how you frame the argument, you may see, depending on how you frame the task, you may see different kinds of biases and content effects. And it's slightly reminiscent of some findings in the human literature, showing that different framings of the syllogism validity task can result in very different conclusions about how biased people actually are. The third task that we considered was the Wayson task. This is the task for reasoning about which examples would falsify a rule. And in this task, we laid out a short situation for the model, which describes the rule and the cards what's on each side of the cards. We describe the 4 cards, and then we ask the model to answer with which 2 cards it needs to flip over in order to check that the rule is being followed. And what we find, again, is that the model is much better at reasoning about rules that are realistic, such as this one. If the children are playing games, then they must have finished their homework, compared to rules that are arbitrary, such as if the card has a number on one side, then it must have a color on the other side. We also ran several other conditions which haven't been explored in the literature so far as we know with humans. And the most interesting one is the case of shuffled realistic rules, like if they're playing games, then they must be guilty. So these rules, we combined 2 different pieces, the antecedent and the consequent, from 2 different realistic rules, so that we get a rule that contains realistic terms but is less obviously plausible as a whole. And surprisingly, the model actually does better at these shuffled realistic rules than the arbitrary rules, though still not nearly as well as it does on the actually realistic rules. So this would be an interesting phenomenon to explore with humans. For the Wason tasks, performance does improve if you provide few-shot examples. And interestingly, you get the most benefit if you give examples which are realistic rules. So on the left, I'm showing performance for 0, 1, or 5 shots on problems of the realistic, shuffled realistic, and other types if you give nonsense examples. And on the right, I'm showing performance if you give realistic examples. And what you can see is that giving realistic examples results in much bigger improvements in performance from giving the example shots. Okay, so to sum those results up, it seems like large language models show some human-like content effects on reasoning about these classic tasks from cognitive psychology involving syllogisms and rules. So what does this imply about human reasoning? Well, a lot of prior explanations of these phenomena have relied on things like assuming humans have dual reasoning systems, system 1 and system 2, or even that we have particular evolved social reasoning mechanisms that we use for the social rules, but not for the other rules. But one of the nice things about these results is that we show a single system, a unitary model, trained on a very simple language prediction task, can present a variety of the phenomena, from more heuristic and unreliable behavior to even more accurate behavior, depending on the content that's being reasoned about and the context in terms of the instructions and examples that are given. And I think these findings could potentially contribute ultimately to some of the debates about human rationality or irrationality. And I'll touch on that in a bit. From the language model side, what I think is interesting about this is while the language models aren't reasoning perfectly abstractly, we've shown that some of their content, the ways that content affects their reasoning, are reminiscent of the ways in which content affects human reasoning. And a corollary of this is that we should be careful about concluding that language models can't reason if they exhibit some particular failures, at least unless we apply the same standard to humans. I definitely want to clarify that I'm not trying to say that current language models are human level in general, though, just that we have to be careful about those comparisons. And there's a number of things that might tend to improve the reasoning in language models. For example, for humans, there's a pretty strong association between formal education, particularly in mathematics, and the ability to reason more systematically on the kinds of tasks I presented before. So one question we could ask is whether some factors analogous to formal education could help language models to reason more consistently. And there have been a few suggestive results along these lines, showing that things like pre-training on logic tasks can improve language models' performance on mathematical tasks, or showing that language models that are sort of taught to bootstrap from their own reasoning processes can reason more reliably. But I'd also like to take a step back here and reflect on this broader question of what reasoning is. So as I said before, there's been these debates in the language model literature about the extent to which they're capable of reasoning or just using a pile of heuristic tricks. And similarly, in the cognitive sciences, the rationality wars have debated the extent to which humans are rational, logical reasoners, or again, more like a pile of tricks. And what I'd say this work supports is the idea that both of these are false dichotomies. Instead, we can perhaps think of a more normative theory of reasoning that's more like a collage of different factors. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we ask why humans and language models show these effects, why we aren't perfectly logical reasoners, to answer this question, we might want to think about, well, what is it that reasoning is actually supposed to achieve? For humans, and presumably for language models, these processes are not an end unto themselves. They're supposed to help us achieve some goal or to make predictions about the next word that's coming. If you consider the case of reasoning about the rules, this is very interesting because the content effects there actually facilitate reasoning in the social situations, which are also the most common ones. So perhaps content affects human reasoning because it leads us to make more reliable, accurate decisions more often in the most important situations, the ones we encounter all the time. And similarly, perhaps it affects language model performance because it leads them to make more correct predictions more often, if nothing else, because they're predicting language produced by humans. And so we can think of this as suggesting a normative reason that actually reasoning perfectly abstractly is not the optimal strategy for either system. And this is related to other cognitive accounts that provide normative theories of heuristics and biases and so on, often by thinking of them as a kind of bounded rationality. That is, it's rational to make this trade-off if you're a system that doesn't have unbounded resources or unbounded time to think. So my takeaway from this work is that maybe we should think of reasoning itself as a kind of collage that involves some logic, but also the use of content and the use of heuristics and so on. So with that, I'd like to summarize the work I described. I started by saying that human reasoning is not a perfectly abstract process, but is instead affected by the content we're reasoning about. That language model reasoning patterns also depend on the content they're reasoning about. And in fact, that language models reproduce some of the classic human content effects on reasoning, including being biased by the believability of a conclusion when they judge an argument, and reasoning better about realistic social rules than arbitrary abstract ones. Note again that none of this means that language models are human-like in most ways even, but it just means that we need to make comparisons more thoughtfully, rather than dismissing language model capabilities entirely just because they happen to use a heuristic or make a mistake in a particular situation. And finally, I'd like to suggest that maybe we should think of reasoning as more of a collage, and maybe there's a normative reason for it to work that way. Now, before we go to questions, I'd like to take a moment to briefly advertise a new paper I put online a few weeks ago on how we should compare language models and humans. And I'm not going to go into the full details, but the point I wanted to make with the paper is that comparisons between different systems need to make sure that the evaluation conditions are matched. And this is something that's been thought about a lot in psychology, for example, when trying to compare the things that humans can do to the things that a monkey or a crow or a mouse can do. And the point I make in the paper is that in general, language model zero-shot evaluation is not comparable to humans evaluated in the lab. Models don't have the kinds of context, motivation, or instructions that humans in the lab do. And what we think of as intuitively as human abilities is often what humans can do at our best, not our sort of average case out of context behavior. I would instead say that human zero-shot eval would be more like shouting a question at a stranger on the street. And actually, this can be pretty hard. You can find some funny videos on YouTube of just how badly people will fail a very easy question if you ask it to them out of context when they're not expecting anyone to ask them a question. So I illustrate this argument with a case study showing that some prior work in analyzing how language models handle difficult syntax structures was perhaps biased by unfair comparisons between the humans and models. So if you're interested in that, please check out the paper. And with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators on this project, particularly Ishita Dasgupta, shown on the left, who's an amazing researcher and really took the lead on this project, was co-first author, as well as Stephanie, Tony, Jay, Darsh, and Felix. And thank you all so much for listening. We should have plenty of time for discussion.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'd like to, yeah, as Andrew said, please, I'd invite the audience to ask some questions in the QA functions. I see there are some questions coming in now, so please keep them coming in the QA function. I'm going to start with some questions, unless you have a question to go with. We go with something.
No, go ahead.
Cool. Okay, Andrew, that's really some really interesting some observations there. Some really interesting observations. But I'm trying to get a sense of what, I don't know. I guess I was expecting that you would have a kind of theory that you'd be pushing about all of this. So, your research question right at the beginning was, will content effects on large language model reasoning match those observed in humans? Well, that's an observation, but presumably there's some kind of hypothesis you're trying to test. Normally we're trying to test some kind of hypothesis without experiments. I just want to try and pin you down on what are the implications of this? So you try, there are loads of things that you could say here. You could draw this out in loads of different ways. You could say there's some kind of deep commonality between the way that humans reason and the language models reason, or you could say that this observation was just a complete coincidence, or you could say also other things. But what I just want to ask you directly, what you think the implications are of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think I wouldn't say that I'm committed to a particular theoretical framework here necessarily. I think one reason this work is interesting is because it sort of provides a falsification, if you want, of some strong claims that have been made in the cognitive literature. For example, I mentioned briefly that people have suggested that, well, perhaps we have an evolved social reasoning mechanism, and that's why it's easier for us to process social rules and so on. And so these kinds of demonstrations that a simple system like a language model that clearly doesn't have an evolved social reasoning mechanism can exhibit the same kinds of biases suggest that those explanations might not be correct. But I do think there's the potential for a more interesting unified account here, which is what I was starting to hint at with the normative story. But I don't think that we're ready yet to say what exactly that account is, although I'd like to point to it as an interesting research question. And I think, the analogy I'd like to make is that people have observed in convolutional networks for quite a while that the representations they form matches those in the human and monkey visual system. And similarly, that people have observed more recently that the representations in these language models match representations in the human language system. So one hypothesis you could have is that something about those common representations is driving somewhat similar processes, and that maybe one of the heuristics that's contributing to human reasoning processes is the kinds of, predicting language things that these models are computing. But I can't test that hypothesis directly with this kind of work. So I think it's an interesting question, but not entirely resolved yet. Does that satisfy you?
I'm not completely sure. You mentioned in your talk, and you also in your answer there, that you kind of referred to some of this this research in the psychology literature about, I think it's called the social exchange theory, that you have based on some results from the Wayson selection task, that humans are basically much better at answering questions when they're about social rules. We're much better at reasoning about somebody breaking a social rule, and the hypothesis there is that we have a special module, that we've evolved a module that's dedicated to reasoning about social situations. And I think that you're implying that your work has some relation to that, but I don't think that you've actually looked into whether social rules have been broken in any of your. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't look like you've actually looked at any social rules in the context of your work. You're really just looking for kind of common situations. So there's a big difference between common situation and a social rule being broken.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So I should have clarified that more. So I actually separately am somewhat skeptical of the claim that it's about social situations rather than just familiar situations, although it's related to my general critique. But it is a good question. And actually, most of the rules that we used in our work, although not all of them, would be what people in this literature would think of as social rules, I think. Like, so things like, if the kids are playing video games, then they must have finished their homework. That's like a social rule that has some plausible social context. Or things like, if the person is going skydiving, then they must have a parachute. You know, these are sort of like restrictions on what people can and can't do based on things that they have or haven't done in the past or their properties. So those are the kinds of things that people think of as social rules. And the fact that the language model is reasoning more readily about those than the arbitrary ones is related to these prior findings. But you're right that it would be nice to disentangle more fully the difference between social rules and just familiar rules for other reasons.
Great, thank you. So I've got some good questions coming in on the QA, so I'm just going to take a quick look at those. Yeah, so there's a question from Laura. Yeah, so yeah, I was going to ask something similar to this, which is, you know, these Wayson tasks. I read the paper and I tried to do some Wayson tasks and I was hopeless at it. I just couldn't do them at all. They're really hard, but really, like, you can kind of solve them mechanically, right? With a pen and paper, you can just figure them out. They're really trivial, actually, if you just use a mechanical kind of rule. So I think that Laura is asking something similar here, which is, can you just get your language model to follow a simple rule, like a mechanical process with a different kind of prompt, and get it to do the same thing? Laura, just correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm not asking the same.
I think that's a great question. And I think that the question might also be, can you get humans to answer it correctly if you give them a simple rule? And I haven't tried this with the language model, but it has been explored with humans a bit. And I think in the human case, it's, as you said, it's like kind of a hard task. So the simple things that you think might help, like instructing people, even like explaining to them sort of like, these are the kinds of examples that falsify a rule, and then showing them an example, not of exactly the Wayson task, but of like examples that falsify a rule, and then giving them the Wayson task. They still don't do that well at it. But I'm sure that if you gave them a specific enough instruction that really broke it down for them, you could get them to do it well. And I suspect, although I haven't tried, that for language models, you could do something similar. The kinds of chain of reasoning prompts that have been explored by Jason Wei and others definitely improve performance on similar kinds of logical inference tasks. And I'd be very surprised if you gave a detailed prompt like that if you couldn't get the large models to do pretty well on these tasks. But it is an interesting thing that we should try. And also, as I mentioned briefly at the end, there's some things like pre-training models with sort of like more mathematical or logical content and so on that also would probably make them do better at this task. But it's an open question.
I suppose, like, the worry with any work of this nature, the kind of prompt-based work, is how sensitive are the results to the prompting strategy, and how, you know, I guess we don't really know how to make that robust yet, but it'll be interesting to know your thoughts on what direction you think we should go in, because it's not easy, but then there must be some kind of general principles that we can use to make sure that our results are not sensitive to the prompting strategy, because it sounds like you could just get any result you want depending on the prompt.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, so that's one of the reasons that I don't always try to go into prompting strategies in my work, because I do think if you give if you tune the prompt enough, you can get many answers. And there have been some papers saying more or less those things. So for example, in this work, most of what we considered was just giving examples of the task that came from a very particular kind. And so there's not like a lot of flexibility on how you set up the prompt there, right? Well, I mean, there could be, like, actually just choosing which examples go into the prompt can affect things a lot, but we just chose random examples for the prompts different for every question. Okay, so, but in some other work on looking at how explanations affect language model learning, I have done a little bit more exploring of prompts and tuning prompts. And in that paper, we do find that, the models are quite sensitive to the particulars of the prompt. There were some kind of takeaways from that I think are more generally applicable, which is that, like, you know, for things like math tasks, actually the more like languagey you can make the prompt, the better. So for example, things like saying what's happening in words as well as equations instead of just equations and so on. So like making things more languagey and producing answers that are more languagey both tend to help. But in general, I suspect that the answer will be models that have a better training paradigm, honestly. Like, I think it's interesting that language models trained on this very simple task are capable of exhibiting some interesting behaviors, but I don't think it's the best training paradigm for actually getting a model to do anything in particular. And you know, most people there's been a lot of interest in prompting, but people who are applying models in practice are almost always fine-tuning them rather than just prompting them. So I think that, you know, if you want to actually get a model to do some behavior, probably you shouldn't try to do it with just prompting, at least unless the model is, you know, instruction tuned or in some other way trained to be more promptable, more reliable.
I'm just thinking, just as you're answering that, I'm just thinking in experimental psychology, you know, it's quite notorious that there's this experimenter effect. So if you do an experiment on mice, like who does the experiment changes the results. Like, there's a very strong effect. I wonder whether you need to sort of get different. You need to like double blind the prompter, and you know, be really, really rigorous about it. I use some of these ideas from experimental psychology in order to get good, robust results here.
Definitely. And I will say, so I did my PhD in cognitive psychology, and I will say that, you know, changing the wording of a question can hugely change the ways that people respond to it. Like, you can get vastly different results from what seems like sort of a superficial change in a question just because it makes people think of it in a slightly different way. So it's not the case that people are totally robust to this, although I'd say they're quite a bit more robust than language models are. Yes, I also think it's important to be more rigorous about how we, you know, make these comparisons of prompts. So there's a really nice paper called True Few Shot Prompting, which was making some arguments along these lines. And in the explanations paper that I mentioned earlier, we did not exactly that because it's hard to, you know, craft a prompt where the person writing it is blind, but we had a blind person see if they could judge whether the prompts came from which condition the prompts came from. That's sort of a way of checking the quality of the prompts independent of the person who created them, but it's not perfect. And I think, yeah, more work along those lines would be good. But yes, generally, I think the methods from experimental psychology are increasingly relevant to understanding the behavior of deep learning systems as these systems start to become more complex and, you know, have some of the more weird quirks that humans have.
Great. Alessio, do you want to go with one while I read the questions to the audience?
Yeah, I have. You touched already a bit about this in discussion, but if you go back to the slide, the section about syllogisms,
Yes.
and you have towards the end a result that showed that, yeah, this one. If you frame it seems like it's the same task or a similar task framed differently, and results improve a lot.
Yeah.
Where, like in this task, the model basically had to finish the sentence, right?
Yeah. So, like basically the task was that you get rid of like the end part of this argument and you just have it complete like what the conclusion should be. The correct.
Right.
Conclusion.
Right. Exactly. Which seems it seems like it's more. So the answering part seems like it's a more logical task, whereas the formal conclusion seems to be more of a language task. So which is in like ultimately what these models are trained on. There are also many generative models that just can produce sentences or finish sentences.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you think that just having a language model that's trained on, forming better sentences, understanding better sentences, will ever be enough to perform well in this kind of tasks? Because even people, especially like people that are less inclined toward logic reasoning, have to train hard if you want to actually grasp it, acquire a different skill set than the language one. So do you think that these language models will ever be good enough in these kind of tasks?
Well, yeah, great question. So I think it's very salient to bring up, as you did, that this framing of the task does make it a little bit more languagey, although we tried with the old framing to have it be kind of languagey too, in the sense that the answer is sort of a short sentence, this argument is invalid. But you're right that this does make it a bit more like the language tasks that the model encounters during training. And it's, I'd say that with the right training distribution, you would of course be able to get the model to be very good at these tasks. I mean, it's doing pretty okay here, and it doesn't maybe it sees syllogisms during training quite a bit, but it's certainly not the majority of the training or anything. So I think that you could get the model to be good at this with a language task, but you're right to ask, is that the right way to get a model to do this? And I'd say no, almost certainly not. Like, if you have a particular task you want to do, you should, either take a language model that's trained and then fine tune it because it'll be way better at that task, or just train a model from scratch, depending on the setting. But, taking a model and applying it zero shot is almost never the right strategy for actually getting it to do a problem really, really well. It's just an interesting scientifically, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I guess there's also a bit to say about the model's ability to maybe generalize, which is also something you touched. The models are better at being consistent, because that, like, language is usually consistent. You can't just normally swap one concept for another and preserve the meaning of a sentence, which is different in a logical implication, whereas the concept doesn't really matter. And that's a completely different task or way of reasoning than what the models have learned. So yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, it is very, it depends a lot on the task. Like in this case, you can see that the model's doing a pretty good job at the inferences about the statements that ostensibly violate the expectations, statements that seem to be false. So it's not like it's just making correct inferences in the consistent case. It's actually doing pretty well in both cases, but it is certainly easier to do the consistent case, and that's probably why, in the other task framing, it's much better at the consistent case, or it's much, well, maybe it's more biased rather than better, but yes. Yeah, so yes.
Right, thank you.
I'm going to ask a question from the audience. So this is from Michael. I'm just going to read this question out. So he says, so these language models are trained on symbol proximity and huge text corpora. How does any organization arise that could explain the dependence of reasoning on believable scenarios? He says, are we just saying reality is more often talked about than we might say fantasy, in inverted commas?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different questions kind of wrapped up in this one. So how does I do think that part of the reason we see these effects is that, reality is talked about more than fantasy and things like realistic rules. So, probably there's some text on the internet about like parents trying to get their kids to do their homework before they're playing games and so on, right? And so that kind of explains why the model's expectations would sort of reflect human ones. And for the natural language inference task, the simplest one, that basically explains the effects. Just completing the that explains the bias effects zero shot. Just like completing the sentence with something more believable explains the bias effects. However, the harder thing to explain is, well, why do those effects go away with examples, and why do you see these content effects even in the syllogism task or the Wason selection task, where the inferences are more complex and the things you're answering about are things like this argument is valid, this argument is invalid, which the model wouldn't have any prior belief over which of those statements is correct, or at least none that's relevant to the particular content of the argument. And that, I think, is a more complex question that I don't fully know the answer to. But I guess one reason this might be true is that, people on the internet, let's say, are making arguments, are responding to other arguments. And maybe it has to do with the distribution of like arguments that get made and responded to. There are more arguments about semi-believable things because if it's totally unbelievable, not many people are going to argue about it. And maybe the most unbelievable things are easy to dismiss or involve more argument about whether or not they're true. And so I think it's quite possible that it's something about the ways that humans interact with each other that's driving the model to exhibit these kinds of effects from observing those interactions. But it's a good question, and I don't fully know the answer. The other thing I'll say is that there could be something more interesting going on here. So, for example, there's this really nice paper by Belinda Lee and Jacob Andreas and someone else whose name I'm forgetting, showing that if you take a trained language model and you have it read through some simple stories about people interacting with objects and stuff, what you'll find is that the model has representations that capture some of the things that we'd think of as sort of like the semantics of the story, like almost like a world model of what's going on in the story. So in particular, you'll find representations of the people that they're being talked about, the objects that are being talked about, their properties and their relations, like who is holding what, and what objects are containing other objects and stuff. And so, like, in the course of predicting text, what I think is happening is that the model, the best way to make predictions about language that comes from the world is going to be to infer some properties about the natural world, right? Because that's sort of the common theme that underlies a lot of the text, not all of the text, but a lot of the text on the internet. And even things like fantasy and so on are often, it's like, well, you change one thing about the world, but you keep almost everything else the same. And so I think that in the process of training, these models are developing some pretty sophisticated expectations about the world. And that perhaps helps them to guess at, what things people would check in a social situation. Like, yeah, people probably would be more likely to check if the kids who are playing video games and the ones who haven't done their homework to make sure that they're doing the right things rather than checking the other ones. Maybe that's something you can figure out just from, reading the subreddits on social advice and stuff. But yeah, it's a great question. Don't fully know the answer.
I still think I have like kind of a follow-on question to that, which is, how, let me just think about this. You spoke at the beginning about the literature about heuristics and this kind of irrationality of humans. I mean, there's been a lot of focus on that, but really, those things are interesting because humans basically are rational, and there are some exceptions, and it's interesting to talk about those exceptions, but that doesn't mean that we're not rational. So just to summarize a lot of discussion, but what you're doing here, you're looking at where these kind of pathological cases, like the syllogisms, humans are basically not reasoning at all in those syllogisms, right? And nor are the language models. Okay, well, that's interesting, but then you need to look at the other side of the coin, which is, well, okay, but does the language model also reason in those cases where humans are performing well? There are two sides to this question. You're looking at one side. It's really much more interesting to look at both, I think.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I mean, it depends on the, language models are good and bad at different kinds of things. I think there has been some very interesting work looking at the cases where they don't do as well as humans at things we're very good at. So actually, Laura, who I think asked the question earlier, had a very nice paper recently on looking at these sort of pragmatic inferences that humans make. Like if you ask me, do you want to chat tomorrow? And I say, I have a day full of meetings. That's not a yes or no answer to your question, but you can sort of take from it like my answer is no, I'm busy, I can't chat tomorrow, maybe some other day, right? And people are quite good at these inferences, but what Laura's paper showed is that language models aren't so good at these kinds of inferences and other kinds. And there are interesting effects depending on, for instance, whether the language model is instruction tuned or not, and so on. So anyway, there's definitely some work out there exploring the kinds of things that are familiar inferences that humans are very good at, that language models might not be as good at. Totally. And I do think that's an important part of the question. I actually, personally, I'm very interested in the role of embodiment and intelligence. And so I was somewhat surprised by how well language models do with no physical experience of the world. And part of the reason I've been studying them is just to try to make sense of it all from that perspective. But I do expect that as time goes on, we'll start to see more and more failure cases where it's like, well, just passive language experience alone is not enough to learn these interesting things. But yeah, the only other thing I'll say about that is that I do think it's important to be careful about how you make the comparisons, though, and that's this other paper that I sort of gave an ad for is partly about that, because I think that the way people do comparisons of language models and humans is sometimes unfair, and it's, we need to think a bit carefully about what is the right way to evaluate a language model in somewhat like the way that people in experimental psychology have been thinking for 70 years about what's the right way to assess a human, to really dig down and find out what they do know, what they can and can't do, and so on.
Great. So I've got a question here from Alberto. He says, out of curiosity, how sensitive were the tested models to key parameters like temperature? Could high values, meaning kind of more creative, damage their performance on these 100% logical tasks?
Great question. So the way we did the evaluation for these tasks was actually deterministic because we did multiple choice evaluation. But yes, I mean, almost always, if you turn the temperature up high enough, you'll get worse performance on generative tasks, although there is often a sort of sweet spot. The second thing I'll say is that it is, there's different ways you can do decoding from these models. And the model performance does depend on the particular way you choose the multiple choice answers. So for most of the experiments in this paper, we use this thing from this R.A. Holtzman paper called surface form competition, which basically is you sort of correct the answers for their prior probability under the model. And this doesn't change the overall kinds of bias effects that we observe, but it does make the model's accuracy much higher in general. And so I think in general, if you're doing evaluation of language models, this is something you should try out. It's a very good way to just make them do better. And so the kinds of biases we observe are not sensitive to that, but the particular number, scores that we get are. So yes, some aspects of how we do the scoring do matter.
Great, thank you. So that's our final question. We've just come up to time. So thanks so much, Andrew. Really fantastic, really, really great talk and a really interesting discussion. So the talk is recorded. So I'm going to put in the chat now the YouTube channel where you can see the talk, and all of our talks are also recorded on there, so you can subscribe to that channel and you get the alerts when things get uploaded. So thanks again to Andrew. Thanks for the audience for great questions. Thanks for coming, and see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
See you. Bye-bye.